Welcome everybody, good evening, welcome to Fabricating Flesh, Fabricating Stories, an event that's part of the King's Arts and Humanities Festival. My name is Anna Maerker and I teach medical history here at King's College London, and it's my great pleasure to have with me tonight two fantastic artists and writers, Eleanor Crook, whose work you've already seen emerging on screen as you came in, and Kelley Swain, who will be reading from her poetry play later today. So the plan for us for tonight is that I'm going to give you a little historical background on the history of fabricating waxen anatomical figures, fabricating fake flesh, as it were, some of the religious, cultural, artistic connotations, but also some of the problems going on behind the scenes, backstage, in one of the most important anatomical modelling workshops of the late 18th century at the Museo la Specola in Florence. About which I wrote a book, but don't worry, I'm not going to try to cram everything into those 10 or 15 minutes. It's just going to be a little bit of backdrop. And then this will be followed by a proper demonstration by Eleanor, who will talking us through some of her process projected onto the screen, and readings from Kelley's poetry play, Opera di Cera. I should also perhaps, before we get started, warn you, although I think reading about the event, you will all be mentally prepared to see some pretty gruesome stuff on the screen. So whether you've had your dinner already or not, please do bear in mind that some of the images you will see today might be a little of an acquired taste. So don't panic. They're all dead. Most of them are fake anyway. So, what I would like you to introduce you to are these models you can see here on screen, the wax models produced in the late 18th and early 19th century at the Museo la Specola in Florence. But before I go into the Florentine models, just a little bit of background, just so you can see where these traditions are coming from. And a lot of it is actually coming from religious practice, in particular from something like the practice of votive offerings. So the idea that you would make fake little representations of body parts as thank you offerings to God or the gods, depending on which religious tradition you're operating in. And some of them would be sort of quite lifelike, little miniature feet, arms, legs, whatever you require, such as this. And this is a tradition which very much carries through into the Christian religious traditions. Another important feed into anatomical models is the early modern tradition of the memento mori, artwork designed to remind you of your mortality, such as, for instance, this half skull, half face, which you can see on display at the Welcome collection. So the idea there very much was to remind you that you will die one day and that you might want to mend your ways just in time. So there are some religious and moral traditions feeding into anatomical modelling. There's also, for instance, the early modern tradition of wax portraiture, so life-size portraits, in coloured wax, representing human sitters, such as this one, who we will return to in a minute, but for now he's just a good example of a fairly lifelike wax portrait, warts and all, as it were. Not the most flattering medium, perhaps, but quite a naturalistic one. There are other more pragmatic anatomical models at the time. This is a so-called obstetric phantom, much less detailed, much less perhaps aesthetically appealing, but very much a hands-on teaching tool which training midwives could use to learn gestures such as turning the child in the womb. Florence, in particular, was a key centre for practices of anatomical modelling in the early modern period, feeding on all these different traditions of practical training, of religious devotion, of moral contemplation, And already before the foundation of La Specola, which is the one I will focus on today, you've got people like Gaetano Zumbo, an artist with a clerical, with a religious background from southern Italy, who in the late 17th century already developed ways of creating fairly realistic anatomical representations, drawing on the tradition of the memento mori, such as this life-sized study of a dead man's head, for instance, which is still on display in Florence to the present day. He also drew on his local religious traditions in the making of little miniature scenes of death and decay, modeled very much after southern Italian nativity scenes. So this, for instance, is one of Zumbo's works, The Triumph of Time, showing Father Time pointing to different stages of human decay. One thing that doesn't come across in this image is that this is a miniature scene. This is very much, pretty much at the same size and setup as the nativity scenes with little wax figurines you would, for instance, see in places like Naples. So creating a little bit of a distance between the viewer and this very uncomfortable subject by miniaturizing this entire display. What you also see in the bottom left is what is presumably a little self-portrait of Zumbo. But let's move on to the late 18th century. Let's move on to the workshop of La Specola in Florence. You can see here what characterizes these models and what still makes them fascinating to modern viewers today. These are models very much designed to represent a beautiful and idealized, healthy human body. They are often represented using expressive gestures. This, for instance, is a life-sized model that seems to be looking out at the viewer in quite an active pose. They're based on numerous dissections, while at the same time not representing any particular body. This is very much an ideal. The most popular type of model, perhaps produced at the museum, is the so-called anatomical Venus, which spawned a whole new sort of genre of anatomical models. This is one example, quite typical for the anatomical Venus. A beautiful young woman, seemingly unharmed by this dissection that's happened to her, adorned with real hair, and one thing that's quite characteristic also of these female models is that she's got a little embryo nesting inside her, which you can see growing there. So this sort of secret of reproduction is being revealed in the anatomical Venus. And here just a little close-up where you can see how this effect of life-likeness is achieved by the addition, for instance, of real hair, by the use of varnish that gives a particular sheen to the surfaces of the intestines and the organs coming out here. And people looking at these models today argue that you can still see both the religious influence and the artistic influence on these models. These are mostly anatomically correct representations of the human body, but at the same time they also resonate with artistic traditions. For instance, some people see the ecstatic face of Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa in some of those anatomical Venuses. Some see a resonance in the reclining human male with Michelangelo's Adam. So you can still see in these models, which were very much meant to be at the cutting edge of 18th century anatomical science, a resonance with contemporary art, with contemporary religious practice. Now, anatomical modeling in the late 18th century was big science. It required a lot of funding, it required a lot of resources in terms of labor, in terms of material. So one thing that I'm particularly interested in as we think about fabrication is to also think about, as it were, the fabric of social relationships that informs the making of these models, the relationships that go on behind the scenes at the modeling workshop and at the museum. Today, you can still go and see these models if you go to Florence, if you go to the Zoological Museum. So you go through a couple of rooms of stuffed monkeys and stuffed birds and all the paraphernalia of a natural history museum, and then you arrive in rooms which, to the present day, contain this anatomical collection of wax models. And in their showcases, they look very peaceful, they look very unproblematic, they look very appealing, and what you don't see is what was going on behind the scenes as the models were made, and that's what I want to turn to just for the last 5 minutes or so. I promised you we'd come back to this fetching chap with the blue eyes and not a lot of hair. This is Grand Duke Pietro Leopoldo of Tuscany, the youngest son of Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, who assumed the Grand Duchy of Tuscany when he was only 18 years old, steeped in enlightened theories, enlightened ideas. He decided he would basically take Tuscany and drag it kicking and screaming into the age of enlightenment. He would use it as a laboratory for creating the perfect state. And for him, the way to create the perfect state was all about science. It was all about educating his subjects in nature, in natural law, in the use of reason. And the way to do that, obviously, was to create a science museum. What he did was to create La Specola, the Royal Museum of Physics and Natural History, as it was called, very much based on his idea that scientific knowledge was the best basis for creating the perfect state. This, by the way, is Pietro Leopoldo's own experimental bench. So when he said that he wanted to use Tuscany as a laboratory, he knew what he was talking about because he was himself quite a keen, especially chemical experimenter. You can still see his experimental bench in the Museo Galileo in Florence today. But back to the bigger experiment. This is the Royal Museum of Physics and Natural History in Florence, where Pietro Leopoldo decided to create the perfect enlightened citizen by putting in a little sort of microcosm of creation. This is the man he put in charge, Felice Fontana, at the time one of the most celebrated Italian scientists. He's buried in the same church as Michelangelo and Galileo. He was also a bit of a grump. I think this portrait with those ridges over the eyes, that's very, very typical of him, and you can see that coming through in the angry letters he keeps writing to the Grand Duke. You can just see the quill scratching deep sort of traces into the paper. Now, objects for the museum came from the old Wunderkammer, the old cabinet of curiosities that Pietro Leopoldo had inherited from the now defunct Medici dynasty. It also came from a big shopping trip around Europe, which Fontana took. It also came from donations. If people came across something that they thought might be interesting to the museum, they would donate it. It also came from in-house production, so the anatomical models in particular were made at a workshop in the museum itself. They were based on observations of actual corpses. The Grand Duke gave permission to the museum to use corpses from the General Hospital Santa Maria Nuova, which is number 3 in your map, and also from the orphanage of the Innocenti at number 4. So corpses both of adults and of children were made available to the modeling workshop, to Fontana and his colleagues for dissection. And they actually had an employee, Giacinto Di Detti, who may or may not appear later in tonight's event, whose task it was to go around with a big wicker basket on his back and to transport body parts from the hospital and the orphanage back to the museum for dissection. Right, so you've met two of the central actors here, the Grand Duke and his museum director, and there were lots of sources of tension in this story. There was tension, for instance, between local medics and Fontana, because the local medics needed corpses for medical education as well, and they were quite angry that Fontana would be using up so many corpses for making models when they could have served to instruct actual medical students instead. There was also tension between Pietro Leopoldo and Felice Fontana, partly because Fontana had a tendency to fall out with everybody, but also partly because Fontana did not expect state supervision. For Pietro Leopoldo, the museum was very much a state institution, and as such it should account for all its expenses. So they asked Fontana basically to keep proper records of how he spent the Grand Duke's money. And Fontana, who saw himself very much as the heir to Galileo, a genius, and all the rest of it, didn't see why, as a genius, he should basically work as a bookkeeper. So he continued to refuse keeping proper records, which then got him in trouble with the Grand Duke. He also didn't keep proper records of the body parts that he used up. So those numbers didn't add up either. That didn't really sit well with people at the hospital. So there were all sorts of tensions there. But there was also, of course, a third party involved, and that's the artists who were involved in making the models. Fontana himself may have had the anatomical knowledge, but he didn't have the skill. The skills came in with modelers such as the head of the modeling workshop, Clemente Susini, who was very much part and parcel of this process. Now, Fontana's idea was that for him, the modelers were just tools in his hands. He thought of himself as the author of this great collection of anatomical models, and Susini was just someone following his orders, who had no agency whatsoever in this process of making these models. And of course, it didn't quite work out this way. Fontana claimed that he could train anyone to become an anatomical modeler. As long as they followed his instructions, they would be just fine. And then he got asked by the Austrian emperor to make a set of copies for Vienna, and decided to do just that, to hire a couple of random artisans to make models for him. And it went horribly wrong. He realized at some point he had to come crawling back to Susini and ask him to complete this second collection for him. And of course, the artists took advantage. They would come late for work, which is constantly recorded in the museum's records. They would drink hot chocolate at work, which they weren't supposed to do, but they did, because they knew that at some point they were untouchable, because Fontana couldn't do the work he did without them. Now, finally, how did the visitors respond? For Fontana and for the Grand Duke, this was all very much a mission of public enlightenment, of secular education, of the rule of reason, and visitors, not surprisingly perhaps, responded in very different ways. There's, for instance, a French magistrate, Monsieur Duparty, who considered the models perfect for moral contemplation. For him, this was not about the laws of nature, this was about morality, this was about ethics, this was about thinking the way humans ought to behave in the world. Moral man, he said, is hidden in the physical man. A French painter, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, even went so far as to say this should be an opportunity for religious rapture. In Monsieur Fontana's cabinet, she said, one kneels and believes, which Fontana would have had a fit if he'd known that. Anyway, so you see, regardless of the enlightenment message of the display, visitors very much took their own observations from this display. So, and I should also mention, of course, one thing we don't know a lot about is the less elite visitors. We know about the people who were sufficiently learned to then write a book about it, or write a letter that would be shared by, local educated circles. We don't know all that much about sort of everyday people coming in, the families coming in with their children. local artisans coming in on a day off, of which there were many. So we have very little trace of them. The only trace we have, perhaps, is a little record in the financial records of the museum, which says, today we spend so and so many lira on a lock which we had to put on the showcase showing the genitals, because people kept touching them. So that's about as much as we know about the responses of the less literate visitors. So just to finish, I would like to point out that, you know, we have these beautiful and very serene surfaces at the museum. We've got the models themselves urging us to moral contemplation, religious rapture, scientific knowledge, whatever it may be that these models inspire in you. But one thing that is not visible so much is that behind this serene surface, we've got all sorts of hidden conflicts, we've got all sorts of multiple meanings, we've got a social fabric that was instrumental in creating them in the first place. Right. I will leave you with this charming wax skeleton and some credits, and leave you to in the capable and very skilled hands of Eleanor Crook, who is our artist for tonight. You've already seen her demonstrate her work today. She's trained as a sculptor at St. Martin's and the Royal Academy, and works both in fine art and in scientific and anatomical contexts, for instance, for the Science Museum and for Guy's Hospital. Her very latest work is Virginia Woolf, who's now on display here at King's, and she will be demonstrating some of her work for us live tonight.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for the wonderful talk. Thank you very much. Can you hear me if I speak like this? Is that all right? I think everybody who makes these wax models probably has to develop their own techniques. There's no book really on how to do it. There's a 19th century book about how to make wax flowers, which is more useful than it sounds. But other than that, there's really very, very little. And the techniques I use, I've just sort of picked up and modified over the years. I was trusted greatly to pop over to Cagliari in Sardinia, where Clemente Cicini's final collection that he made for the King of Sardinia just before 1802 resides. And they bravely trusted me to fix a few broken bits. And it was very interesting to get that close to them with the cases off and to get a feel for what they were made of and how they were made. Quite differently from how I make mine, in fact. The waxes that were available to people then were really very, very different. The ones I use are offshoots of the petrochemical industry. I don't think there's very much organic in this stuff. They won't give me the exact recipe either at British Wax Refining Company in case I start to mix my own and undercut them. So what exactly is in this, which is my absolute staple wax, and a harder version of it, which is what I cast into to show in, embarrassingly, I can't tell you. I think it's some mixture of microcrystalline wax. There's definitely something like French chalk or talc in it. If I just pass a few dabs around, you can have a quick mangle of them and share it down, so you just have a feel of exactly how biddable this stuff is. So I'll give you a hair as well. I don't include those. Yeah, what's the name? So this is number 1704. And you really can make anything. Doesn't smell much. It's not very romantic material. It's sort of industrial material. But everybody's having a bit of a twitch and a pinch of that. That, you see that? That stuff. That's pure beeswax, and this is one of the components of a Cicini model. When you collect beeswax from the bees, it's yellow. And in the old days, whole fields were given over to the bleaching of blocks of beeswax. I've got a photograph of my Red Hill wax factory in the 19th century with the fields behind it with just enormous great blocks of white wax bleaching in the sun. And a lot of the historical waxes, once they've been modelled and painted and put in museums for 100, 200 years, they start to go yellow because that's the bleaching process reversing. I'm sure there are chemists here who know why this is, I don't really. Sassini's waxes don't yellow, they're great. The reason they don't yellow, I think, is because he included in them a very, very expensive component called Chinese wax, which is a white wax, an insect-produced wax, but it's not produced by bees, it's produced by minuscule little insects that live permanently on a leaf, and on the leaf they throw out a carapace of white wax, and they live underneath it. That's what protects them from the ants that want to eat them. And these were collected in China, these little nibs of white scalar wax, and produced and purified as an industrial product called Chinese wax. Now, greatly to my delight, the little insect that produces this pure, white, hard, excellent quality wax is called Ceraplastes sinensis, or Chinese wax worker. It's my little tiny colleagues, and they just hang around on these leaves, and they were farmed. You can still just about buy it, and it costs about £60 an ounce. This is a very rare material, and I don't use it, I can't afford it, but I've got a little bit just to pinch out nostalgically. So that's one reason the Sassinis are so hard, and one reason why I think they don't yellow. This is Madame Tussauds wax. I've had it a few years and it has yellowed a bit, in fact. But luckily, fortune and fame in our society are so fickle that you'll probably end up back in the pot before you go yellow. So it goes. That's Tussauds wax, and that, I think, it must have some beeswax in it, but it's also an industrial product, and it comes from the same factory. It's very hard. It's harder than what I use, and they entirely cast into it. They don't model in it. So I use these two types of wax myself. The 1704, which is very soft, and it's soft like plasticine. I mean, you can really do absolutely anything with it. And a 1718, which is quite hard. And I have to model that with this unprepossessing weapon, which is a blowtorch. It comes from a strange hobby called scrapbooking. And there are shops that have little bays where they say scrapbooking, and they sell this. I don't know what they use it for. Anybody? So that's those. And then, for example, I mean, here I am doing a rather basic anatomical facial muscles over a plaster skull that I've copied up from a real one. And because the wax is so soft, you can see that it's very biddable, and as long as you sort of know what you want to add and remove, it's as easy as icing a cake, I suppose, perhaps easier. And a lot of the sort of experience in handling the material is just knowing how to produce a smooth surface, how much pressure it'll take before it sort of stretches and pulls away. It's a very pale material, so if you want to cast a strong shadow in it, you have to make quite a deep groove. If I'm putting muscle fibres on, which if you've ever, sorry for the vegetarians, but if you've ever eaten a chicken breast and pulled it apart into long fibres, that's muscle fibres. If I'm putting those on, which circulate around the eye in this muscle, the orbicularis oculi, so if I draw these on, so you can sort of inscribe these muscle fibres. The special effects people showed me that if I take a piece of plastic and and then inscribe the muscle fibres through the plastic, like that. It doesn't pull up the little bubbles of wax, so I can do it more cleanly. That's straight out of the sort of Hollywood special effects tip box. Very handy. This is for texturing dinosaurs as well. So we can put our muscle fibres on like that without picking up any wax. Let's go into that little area there. And you know, if I was really going for it to do a very showy, super accurate museum model, I'd probably spend an hour and a half on each eye doing this, just getting it exactly right. I'm showing you quickly what I actually do in practice, very slowly. But that's the sort of trick anyway, for those. He's looking a bit sorrowful without his nose. So if I tend to build a nose by starting from the nasal cartilages themselves. I'm going to start with a septum, with a nasal septum, which is the, it's the tough wall between your two nostrils on the inside, which abandons you if you abandon yourself to habitual cocaine use. I'm told this happens because the cocaine contracts the small blood vessels that supply it, and it dies of despair, leaving you with one large flapping nostril in the centre, which is not a good look. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I dropped that. So, I did a little bit of work and was very kindly trained by Professor Richard Neve, who is the specialist in this country in forensic facial reconstruction from skulls, which he does and did for many years for the police and archaeologists. And there's a lot of measurements that you can take from particular anatomical points on a skull that give you clues as to how deep the soft tissue on average was over it in life. And one of the ways I was taught to estimate the size of a nasal septum to the very tip of the living nose from a skull was to, let's see if I can do this on the screen so you can see. Take an angle out from the nasal bones, which is the sort of bony bridge of your nose that you're used to wearing your specs on. And then on a skull, after all the soft tissue's gone away, there's a little spine that sticks out at the bottom and it sticks forward. It's got the nasal spine and it's right at the bottom. You could probably feel it on yourself as a very tender point just under there, yes? On a person with a nose like mine, that point probably tips up slightly. And on a sort of Basil Rathbone, Sherlock Holmes aquiline nose, it surely points down a little. And on more regular noses, it probably points straight forwards. And so you can use the angle of that tiny little nub of bone that sticks out from the nasal aperture to give you a clue as to what manner of nose you're looking at. And they've done a lot of CT scans of living people, compared their skulls with their soft tissue, and come to some pretty reliable conclusions about what the skull can tell you. So I've probably been a little bit mean with my nasal septum. Just add a little bit more there. So I'll work with something like that. Let me just turn him. Yeah, got some sort of a proboscis coming there. It always looks rather large to begin with because you haven't got this soft tissue here taking up some of its length. Now, have you ever noticed that some people's noses seem to have a cleft in the middle, like Gérard Depardieu? And others still seem to come to a very perfect point. And others, if you look really closely at the front, seem to have a row of 3 little hard shapes in the middle. That's because the nasal cartilages line up as a threesome. Your septum is in the middle and it's a separate piece. And the other nasal cartilages, I always think of them as, you know those hula hoops you can buy to eat, yes? If you open one of those and slightly flatten out the side, can you see that? That sort of shape. Yes? I've never been able to show this process so easily before. It's great. This is very, very nice. It's like having you all with your faces right down on this detailed work. There we go. Can you see those two shapes? These form the wings of your nostrils. They're called the alar cartilages. And you can see, can't you, how a person could easily end up with a nose with a bit of a cleft in the middle if these two were slightly forwards, or a very pointed nose if they were slightly back, or how it would line up as a triple shape. So I'm going for a sort of triple shaped line up. The two the nasal cartilages that give you this sort of pitched roof slope further up the nose. They're little almond-shaped pieces of cartilage, really. If I knew more about facial embryological development, I could explain to you better why the nose comes to be made up of this patchwork of cartilages. But I've yet to learn it up. So those little almond-shaped bits go on like that. Okay? And then, rather like, have you ever seen one of those fish with a many-plated head called a coelacanth? Rather like that way of plates all forming together, there are yet more nasal cartilages that take up those spaces behind there, all jointed together like a little jigsaw. And they're nice to see, a bit fiddly to produce. And they come to fill up some of this back section here. I'll just rough them in for you. Bit big. There we go. And the back part of your nostrils, this here, is neither cartilage nor bone. It turns out it's made of what the textbooks tell me is fibro-fatty tissue. That's right here. And those are the structures that form the soft parts of the nose. All we have to add is a layer of skin over that, which you can do by pressing this out to form a thin membrane and sort of just putting it over. And you have the shape. And I never get bored of sculpting noses from these elements, because if you use the right elements, they're always quite convincing. And I've even been trusted to give little practice sessions to plastic surgeons on this, because as I was saying last night when we were talking about Virginia Woolf, the very smallest additions or subtractions of material when you're doing that are very telling to the eye of someone who's looking either at it as a waxwork or even more so, I think, if it's real surgery. So this is a very pliable and biddable material that you can use to practice on this. So that's how I put these anatomies together. Obviously it takes absolutely hours, and there's a lot of minutiae that I could go into here, but I suspect you'd like to see me do some of the colours as well. Yeah. Anna kindly said when I said, what shall I bring to demonstrate on? Just bring whatever you're working on. Unfortunately, I'm working on 2 models showing the 3 stages of syphilis. I'm sorry about this. One of which is painted and one of which is painted and all but finished, and the other of which I can show you some of the colours. I hesitate. Okay, and this is the one that's in the middle of being painted. Let me talk to you a bit more about materials. And again, I'll use Cecchini as a reference. When you look at some of his multicoloured models, you can tell that the wax being used isn't all one colour. He's put colour into the wax. And I can and often do that. There's no trade secret here. You just melt it down in a double pan. You don't put it onto direct heat because it can go up like a chip pan. You melt it down in a double pan with a dab of oil paint. And the tiniest amounts of oil paint will suffuse quite a big vat of wax. And I'm pretty sure this is how Cecchini was doing it. I've tried doing it by using pure pigment into wax, and it goes lumpy. So the pigment already has to be very finely ground, I think, into a carrying oil of some sort, which in a modern oil paint, and I've got loads of them, it's just linseed oil. Are there any conservators or sculptors with us? Oh, you all know this better than I do. I should clear off. So yes, I melt it down into the body of the wax. Very little into this particular wax. I chose this one. I often use myself as a colour reference because I'm always there. And I'm a very pale person. It's the whitest colour I can find in my own skin before I add any oil paint to it. Now, the Cecchini colours, and your amazing research has turned up all his shopping lists and so on, and lists of colours that are available. A lot of them aren't so easy to get hold of now. There's a sulfate of mercury, there's an arsenic sulfide, there's some terribly poisonous chemicals to the degree that it didn't surprise me enormously that just after he'd finished his extraordinary collection for the King of Sardinia, he died. And I could scarcely believe it was anything but a toxic death. And there are red pigments that can only be found in a seam of pigment high up on a cliff in Spain that have to be brought down by archers from the top of the cliff and collected into little pans at the bottom. So there's some incredibly rare, beautiful pigments in a Cecchini, and I've got a whole separate sort of talk on that. The pigments I've come to use are really old-fashioned as well, because I just know from the example of ones in museums that they will last. I think if I have a sort of point of pride as an art person, I'm not into special effects. I like things that I think will still be around in time, and things that you can sort of send forwards into the future, like some of these have been sent forwards to us. And so I'm attracted to using materials that I can rely upon. A material that you find in Cecchini's wax, along with Chinese scalar insect wax, beeswax, spermaceti oil from the whaling industry, which we really can't and don't get now. Tallow, animal fats, tallow, and I'm sure other kinds of fats and blubbers from the whaling industry that we can't get now. But also many, many products from the pine tree in the form of resins and varnishes and turpentine. I was pleased to discover a sort of material continuity of what he was using, in that the varnish that you find on some of his shinier pieces is damar varnish, which is, it's basically a slower version of turpentine. It's a resin from the pine tree. Turpentine is what I've often used to get the basic colours on because it speeds them up and just clings them into the wax so nicely. But there was a very vicious solvent that was being used to remove this up in Cagliari. Oh, all right. And that was also from the same pine tree. Do excuse me, I can talk shop for ages. So if I just show you a little bit of the painting. Just a brush. Yeah. Let's pull this up here. you see that? There we go. It's looking pale and miserable in every direction. This is a useful pigment for anatomical models. It's iron oxide, which is basically the iron in your blood. It's a sort of hemoglobin colour. And can go on these models in places of sorrow and regret. I was working with Henry de Vries, who's a Dutch venereal diseases surgeon in Amsterdam, who was able to tell me all about these terrible adventures of syphilis in the human body. And how, for example, on this lesion, which is a good example of secondary syphilis, the grey material in there, the battle there has been lost. This material is dying or dead. But this swollen part here that has a greater blood supply that is rather pink, that's where the battle's raging between the spirochete and the immune system. And it's spreading outwards, and if the immune system doesn't win, it's going to start raging in this sort of scale and spread even further. And we were talking about this at dinner last night, as often happens. My very learned friend Brian Horowitz there told me that although the illness itself has many, many pains, Henry de Vries told me that these appalling lesions are more or less impossible to feel because the damage has been done and the nerve endings are gone. I'm going to have to stop, I can tell. So I'll just keep going with a bit of iron oxide and hand you back to Anna.
Thank you very much. I could watch this for ages, despite the gruesomeness of it all. But we do also have another artistic response to this tradition of wax modelling in the form of a poetry play by Kelley Swain, who's published a number of volumes, both of poetry and prose. She's a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, as well as of the Royal Society of Arts. And one of her works, Opera di Cera, waxwork, is very much a response to and an imagining of the human drama behind the production of these fantastic models. So without further ado, please welcome Kelley.
Thank you. Eleanor Crook is an impossible act to follow, so I'll do my best, but I could listen to her all day, and luckily I've had the chance to, because both Eleanor and Anna's work greatly influenced this book, which is the next journey for this project is going to very hopefully become a libretto by a very exciting young female composer, Cheryl Frances Hode, who's been writing things for the proms recently, so I'm really excited about that. But because we'll run a little bit late, but I'll try not to run too late. Opera di Cera is based on learning about the waxworks, and as Anna told you, Cintio, Gian Cinto, he's the first character I met in this story who's one of the real historical figures from the wax modeling workshop, and he was the chap who had the great job of carrying around the body parts. And I actually learned about him through an academic lecture, so you know, don't quit your studies. If you're interested in poetry, it's definitely worthwhile crossover. And because he was this real character who had this absolutely unreal job, I began researching the waxworks and just very serendipitously met Anna. She shared with me her book, which was yet to be published at that point, and everything went from there. So my characters are drawn from the real history of the waxwork shop. Fontana, the rather angry master of the workshop, Cintio, his sort of servant, and of course Susini, the wax modeler. But you might have noticed, of course, that there aren't really any women in this story, nor are there women's voices, and indeed the most famous female figure is that of the silenced Venus. And so she became a character too, and I drew on my work as an artist model to kind of collate something that didn't exactly happen in the workshop. The wax modelers wouldn't have worked from real living models. All their models were dead, but the artists would have probably studied art and studied life models previous to the workshop. So Venus becomes a character, Teresa, as well, and Teresa and Susini have a romance, and I drew on the Pygmalion myth and the Frankenstein myth and a bit of Romeo and Juliet and kind of got into this mashup tragedy that was really great fun. So I'm just going to read a few poems, and they're each in a different character's voice. So I'll just say the character before I read the poem. And this is the prologue, which kind of introduces the scene. And if you didn't get it from Anna's talk, which I hope you did, you can go see these wax models today, and I highly recommend it. They're amazing. They're really the same as they were in 1774. So, Venus. Wide granite stairs, high windowed halls, and finally the tower, clicking clocks on 7 floors that tightly mark the hours. A Tuscan yellow castle, more like a citadel, follows creation from the womb to heaven or to hell. Still and airless, silent rooms with 100 staring eyes. Tigers, zebras, bats, baboons, all silenced in their hides. The octagonal tower blinks a monocle to the night, while window after window shutters out Italian light. Wax, feather, fur, and skin remain suspended in the dusk, while life in Florence tumbles on with bustle and with busk. The men within La Specola are watching, and they watch, for their demanding work requires caution, calls reproach. Here I have a tale to tell of how the wax was made, the famous Venus, who even now is apex of her trade. Prepare your heart, stomach, and mind before we can begin the story of the tragic Florentine Pygmalion. Bits of the nose are starting to fall off, which is slightly disturbing, perhaps appropriate. Thanks to Anna's research and her generous sharing of her research, I was able to learn amazing tidbits that could only come from someone who knew the language, which was not me, it was Anna, and was able to glean these amazing little notes that were written, like not only the letters, but these sort of side notes in the documentation of La Specola. And Anna also taught me some really exciting Renaissance swear words. So one of my poems begins with this. And because this is going online, I won't translate it, but you can speculate as to what the word means. But this is Cintio. Baron Fotuto, the cloaked man curses, congealing from tomb shadow to living flesh. I drop my wicker basket. A hand rolls out, reaches back in gray accusation, followed by a tumble of soft shapes, kidney, 2 lungs, tangle of intestine. I knew it, wastrel, the cloaked man cries. Your master Fontana shall pay. Specimens belong with the surgeons. Students need these bodies. Your museum should not compete. I retreat. The man stalks into dark. As if at prayer, I kneel at the familiar pit with a sigh. In go the lungs, then the hand, intestine, kidney. The stillborn I pull from the wicker basket from the hospital of the innocents should be tucked into hallowed ground with all the lost orphans. It too slaps into the pit. Assistants have no time for pity. I make my way twice each day to the orphanage for children, part or whole, twice to Hospital Santa Maria Nuova for corpses full grown. I barely have time to eat. Hunger rasps my stomach while the ruined side of my face twitches, stunned and twisted. In the royal kitchens, before I was melted and sent to work for the wax makers, I was warm and fed. Now I starve while I handle the dead. I'm going to stick with some of the more technical poems that were directly influenced by both Eleanor and Anna's work. So this is Susini, and he's reflecting on exactly how he makes these waxworks, and especially how he would have, as Anna pointed out, taken poses not only from classical sculpture, but also from really famous books of anatomy, because of course they would have been studying these. Vesalius, Albinus, Haller, Victizur, Loder, Sommering, Weitbrecht, Hunter. We prop up the tomes with brushes, boxes, bones, break their spines, splatter them with turpentine. Vesalius, Albinus, Haller, Victizur, Loder, Sommering, Weitbrecht, Hunter. A corpse dissected for each image made, no, probably more, exactly displayed. The image is chosen, the dead compromised, for thousands of waxes, for life stylized. Vesalius, Albinus, Haller, Victizur, Loder, Sommering, Weitbrecht, Hunter. The museum's goal with each model cast, creating waxworks to teach, to last. I pray that once this work has ceased, corpses stay buried, the dead rest in peace. And as we heard from Anna too, Fontana was really an unpleasant character, which if you need a kind of evil genius is quite convenient. So as this project developed and as the story took shape and as I drew more and more from myth, Fontana, as well as being a very controlling and difficult figure, began to develop an obsession with flesh that went beyond his waxworks. And one of the wonderful stories that Anna told me was about how he was, it was documented that he would sort of forget a bit what he was doing, and he'd do something like, he'd be dissecting a hand and then he'd just sort of put it in his pocket and take it home, which, as we learned, the Duke did not enjoy this because we weren't keeping track of the body parts. So Fontana, because we know he really didn't keep his accounts very well, which if you deal with funding bodies nowadays, you can't get away with it all. He becomes a kind of glutton, and I tried again to get all the deadly sins into this book because that's fun, you know. So this is a villanelle, because of course, as they say, the villain should always have the villanelle. Fontana. I find it soothes my mind to have a treat. Disturbed by salivation, I gasp, waking, go to buy the butcher's finest meat. Dissection's rich rewards cannot be sweet. In my fine work, no flesh am I forsaking, but find it soothes my mind to have a treat. Flies converge in cities' grasping heat, and specimens grow too ripe for the taking. I go to buy the butcher's finest meat. Ensure my rising debts remain discreet. Suspect he thinks things sacrosanct I'm breaking, but find it soothes my mind to have a treat. On the table lies a tongue from down the street. The bodies, they embody all my nerves and shaking. To soothe, I buy the butcher's finest meat. Assuaged of all my hungers, I can sleep. Salivation, my salvation in the making. I find it soothes my mind to have a treat and go to buy the butcher's finest meat. And because I made such a point of saying that the women didn't have a voice, I certainly must read one or two of Teresa's. And she's, again, the model who kind of becomes the Venus, because as you will have seen, they all had the fetus in the womb, and the question of where the Venus's fetus comes from is a rather important one. And that's where things get a bit darker, if they're not dark enough already. So this is earlier in the romance, Teresa. Your fingers strum, scrape, my lemon pith is sweet, you say, and you grow younger, lustrous, each time richer. I grow addicted until I am raw, hollow, scooped out, polished, an offering, this chalice, pelvic girdle, fountain of life, youth, the grail you tongue, swallow, but you are salt thick and I grow parched on you, skin and sweat, longing, a delirious feast. I could live for days on the scent of you alone. You send the slick home, drug my senses, perfume my nose, my eyes weep your fluids, which I have consumed, but my every bite and suck yields more of me to you until I am entirely folded in, vine-wrapped by flesh and limb, your coarse hair at groin, armpit, chin, a dense carpet, my musky one, my blood-thick love. Just below the point of my navel, my guts hunger and cry for you. Feed me your flavors, drown me, let us mingle, infuse me with your vital essence. And I'll just wrap up. So just in case I haven't given the game away, this is a tragedy. And I'll just end with Susini. No greater sorrow have I known than in this sparrow weight of bones. My loves are gone, my bride, my son. Now let me die alone. A twisted path we all have taken. Now I know I am forsaken. I took pride in our creation. I see I was mistaken. Fontana may be skilled and wise, but trapped in Cintio's wicked lies. So if we knew, we turned our eyes. The devil's in the compromise. Without her, I cannot remain. The blackest bile will rise again. My spirit will not bear the pain. And so to this refrain. No greater sorrow have I known than in this sparrow weight of bones. Cease you now, sad metronome, and let me die alone. And on that note, thank you very much.